discussion.
Yes, when you are.
Facebook feed, we can check it and make sure.
Hey, Dean. Hey, Brian.
Not my job. That is wise. That's very
Hi,
wise.
everybody. Can you hear me?
Can just barely hear you, Brian.
Okay, let's see. What do I need?
Oh, there we go. There we go.
Better now?
Yep.
Okay.
Water supply.
Spectre, right?
So, Brian, that's obviously not a current picture from your cabin.
I hope not. Actually, my daughter and son-in-law were up there this weekend. There's a lot of snow up there. And you probably saw Grand Targhee had 16 inches this morning, and I think about 14 yesterday morning. So we've really gained.
I heard we're gaining ground fast on snow water equivalent in eastern Idaho.
Oh yeah. I'm going to call Jeremy Dalling today and tell him we're ready for spill. Think that'll get anybody mad? I mean, ready for spill for recharge, not ready for spill for Shoshone Falls.
Yeah, we just want to make sure that, you know, they're really ready for it and there's no storage shortfalls.
Brian, O1 sent out a deal saying they thought in about a month, there would be a flood control operation. So
Yeah.
I think everybody's got that message and they're gearing up for that.
Yeah. And I have a feeling this last couple storms might have moved that up by at least a week anyway.
Yeah, as of this morning, the snow water equivalent is 110 above Heisey.
Yeah.
111, excuse me.
Well, and I got to think Ryrie's going to be getting a little bit worrisome before too long too.
Yep.
Or if
Henry's
not
Fork
worrisome,
still-
at least enough to where we might have some coming down through there.
And Henry's Fork still just a little below 100.
Yeah.
So, but then it also looks like we're going to have a few dry days coming up.
Yeah. Well, Dean and I both had field runoff the last couple of days at our places.
You don't have that much snow anyway, do you?
What did you just say?
Not that much, but the ground's still frozen, which is unusual for this late, at least in my area.
I still have a little snow. We got about a 3 inches between 3 and 4 inches of snow on Sunday morning at our neighborhood. So on frozen ground.
It looks like we still got a couple of minutes and still waiting on a few folks.
See, we're missing Al and Pat.
Pat, I don't think we were expecting Al today.
Okay.
He had a conflict.
Okay. Jeff, did you get any snow up your neighborhood this weekend?
In my local neighborhood?
Yeah.
Oh, we got a couple inches here in Boise. At home, I don't think, I think we got about 3 or 4 inches about Wednesday, Thursday, and then another inch over the weekend.
Okay, there's Dale. suggest we give just another minute or so for any other board members that hop on the line.
Okay. Let me know when you think we ought to start here, so.
Let's go ahead and get it going, Dean.
Okay. All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to our Aquifer Stabilization Committee meeting number 125, held February 18th, 2025 at the Water Center and on Zoom. I'd like to welcome everybody, and I think we got enough board members here, so I guess we're ready to start with our program. Who's our first presenter today, Brian?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, our first presenter will have Wesley give an update of where the ESPA Aquifer Recharge Program is at right now.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Wes.
Good morning, everyone. Good. So just for a really quick update of where the recharge program is at as far as this session goes. Sorry as I adjust things on my screen. So to start with, as of yesterday, we're at a little over 81,000 acre feet. We are currently recharging 533 cubic feet per second. And the dots are proportional. So Twin Falls is around 8,000. Southwest Irrigation District is at a little over 9,000. And AFRD2 is at a little over 65,000. And so this is the graph pretty much everyone's familiar with at this point in time. You can see where this non-diversion part in here, that ended on the 15th of February, and we're back to diverting everything that's available. Gives an idea of the distribution. Southwest Irrigation District was off a little bit as they're working on their meters in this part right in here. And then just far as current conditions, so there's 432 coming out of Minidoka. We're recharging the 533. And of course, there's 0 going past Milner, which that means there's about 100 CFS of gains. That's up from the last time I reported, that was a month ago, where it's around 60, probably in relationship to this weather that we've been getting, and the drains associated with this area have picked up a little bit, so that's where that increase is coming from. So after that, that is all that I have. Any questions?
Hey, Wes, Brian here. Did you calculate what the size of the void was from the Milner spill there? Around 35,000 was it, or do you know?
It was around 36,000. That's not exact. I haven't looked at the final number. I apologize. I should have done that, but the last time I checked, it was around 36,000 acre feet.
Well, we'll expect you to fill that in 6 days here once we get going.
If the water is available, we'll do our absolute best, sir.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
Wes, are you doing the water availability analysis?
I am not.
So, Mr. Chairman, just to lead off with that, as you know, one of the actions resulting from the 2024 settlement agreement and mitigation plan between the ESPA groundwater districts and the Surface Water Coalition was an agreement to ask the legislature to increase the state-funded ESPA recharge program goal from 250,000 acre feet to 350,000 acre feet on an average annual basis. The legislature currently has both House Bill 193 and potentially a joint resolution in front of them that would increase that recharge goal. Because of these reasons, and because of some ongoing discussions about an agreement to allow some flow to go past Milner Dam on an ongoing basis for downstream purposes, it seemed a good idea to ask David Hokema to review the water supply availability to both meet the higher recharge goal and meet that downstream bypass flow. So we've asked David to do that, and he's going to present that analysis.
Okay, members of the board, this is the recharge potential at Milner. It's not the potential, it's more of a analysis, how much water's there. We probably can't ever get to the full quantity available, but I liked a couple pictures here from a field trip we took. This is off the north side canal to a recharge site on April 19, 2024, at least that's the date on my camera. And then there was a little bit of spill going past Milner at that time. And so if you look at the history of the ESPA, we had a period of surface water development from pre-1912, but that's when the graph starts. And then there was a period of groundwater development. And during that period of groundwater development, it's not as obvious on the surface water development phase, but on the groundwater development phase, I'd like to point out that as we're headed downward in our trajectory on the ESPA, we hit a pluvial period here. Pluvial is the opposite of drought. In the late 80s, where we really saw the aquifer rise, or early 80s, where we really saw the aquifer rise. And then in the late 90s, we had another set of pluvial years where the aquifer rose. And then it continued downward until in 2014, the state really ramped up the recharge program. And then in the following year, in 2015, the settlement agreement was established. And then we have this large rise in the aquifer right after that. And that is not a pluvial period in any comparison to what we saw in the early 80s or late 90s, yet the rise in the aquifer is very similar. So we'll just look at that a little bit, but before we do, again, this is a modeling exercise that Alex Moody did for the department using the aquifer model, and it indicates that without the settlement agreement, the aquifer would have continued on its downward trajectory with a little bit of a bump in 2017, which we all know was a very significant kind of pluvial year, but it was a single event. So if you look at the climate conditions on the ESPA, this graph looks at two periods. One is the period of surface water development. From the graph of 1913 to 1940, those are the gray triangles. And then below that is the black dots, which is from 1980 to 2010. On the left axis is the rise and fall of the aquifer, according to the USGS, and then according to Mike McVeigh's analysis, which is that graph we saw earlier with the blue bars. And then on the bottom is a data set from the PRISM data set that looks at the difference between precipitation and potential evapotranspiration. So you'll notice in the Snake River Basin, evaporation always exceeds precipitation, or at least the potential evaporation. And so the numbers are all negative, but negative 600 puts you right in the middle climatically of what we would expect to see in the Snake River Basin. And and you'll notice, of course, in the rising limb of the aquifer, when we're at 600, the aquifer was gaining about 750,000 acre feet per year during those climatic conditions. And then if you look at the climatic conditions from 1980 to 2010, the aquifer was losing under normal conditions. So the trajectory was downward. But the range that the aquifer can gain or lose, given historic management, varies from about 1.5 million acre feet to a loss of over 1.5 million acre feet, but biased toward the losing side. I would like to point out in here that all these black dots that are in this under these extreme pluvial conditions all come from the 80s and 90s. I don't have the 50s in here, but there'd be 1 year in the 1950s here. And I believe it's either the 60s or the 70s produced another year out in that level. But those back-to-back pluvials, that's what we saw in that rise in the aquifer, in those two large humps as the aquifer was declining. So if we model that out, not using the aquifer model at all, but just looking climatically, we should have followed the gray line. The black line here is the actual aquifer levels. The gray line is what climate tells us the aquifer should have done given the management conditions from 1980 to 2010. And then the black line there is black dotted line is Alex Moody's use of the aquifer model. So we have a pretty tight correlation between what the aquifer model is telling us and what climate alone tells us. So that's a plus toward the aquifer model. So if we look at the water supply available at Milner, again, we can see there's a lot of water available in the early 80s, late 90s, but those are kind of anomalous conditions. And then if you look from 2000 onward, you get a mix of drought years with a couple of pluvial years thrown in there. If we look at the distribution of the spill past Milner during this time frame, including what got recharged, so we've included that since that could have been spilled past Milner. You can see there's a wide swing as high as over 6 million acre feet for the entire period, which is on the left. And then it varies by decade. The 80s and the 90s providing quite a bit of water. In the 2000s, that was our driest decade on record, rivaling the 1930s. It's a little hard to tell which was drier. And then we go back into the 2010 situation. So in the 2000s, if you look at the median available, so that would be the center of the distribution. Mathematically, it's 290,000 acre feet in our driest decade during this period. But the average, because we're skewed high because when we spill water past Milner, we spill quite a bit. We're at 668,000 acre feet. So there's water in the basin to hit that 3,500 or 350,000 acre foot target. This is just some climatic periods. This is just looking at the climate conditions. So you can see those pluvial blue bars in the late 80s, early 80s, late 90s. And then the distribution since then has been biased a little on the drier side, but we have a couple of years in here. But what I want to point out is, as we go through these next graphs, is that we can kind of foretell when we're going to get a good recharge year. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a pluvial year. For example, 2000, which is one of the worst drought years. I think it's the fourth most significant drought. It wasn't a drought year from an irrigation perspective because the reservoir system was loaded after coming out of the 90s. And even though it's a drought year, it's a great year for recharge. So if we look at the 2000s, you can see our year 2000, you can see that there was roughly around 4,000 CFS, give or take, available for most of the winter as they're exercising flood control to bring the reservoirs down to a space that they can capture whatever snowpack is developing in the mountains. And so we can see that because we're coming out of a pluvial year, there's a pattern that the next year is probably your best recharge opportunities. So 2001, we enter into the drought, and we all know that when you're into your second drought year and beyond, there's a very limited amount of recharge available. But then as you go into 2006, that was a relatively pluvial year. Most of the water is available after April. You get this big surge, and not a lot of that can be captured. It's really hard to capture that because the canals are running, and you've got limited excess water you can run down those canals to get into a recharge pit that just won't naturally be part of the incidental recharge in the system. So you just have limited capability. But in this little hump where they're doing some flood control in here, that's an opportunity for some excess recharge. But the following year, 2007, which was a significant drought year, and 2006 wasn't a wildly pluvial year. If you look here, in fact, 2006 it's pretty close, is actually on the dry side, but snowpack wise, it was decent. And then we go into this drought year in 2007, but because the reservoir system was relatively full, you get some recharge out of that. Now that's not the best example because we're not looking at a strong pluvial year, but even in that situation, you have an opportunity through the winter to exceed what would, the minimum recharge levels. So then if we look at the next one, 2009, again, it's hard to capture a good chunk of this flood control event. But in the following year, as they're evacuating and preparing for that season, that's when you have the opportunity to recharge potentially up to around 2,000 CFS through most of the winter in 2010. So then we'll go to 2011, which was a true pluvial year. And flood control started as far back as January. But then by April, you get that main surge, which not as much of that can be captured. But then as you go into 2012, you've got a lot of water that can be captured all winter long. And then we'll go to our next one, which is 2014. 2014 was coming out of two really dry years. So it looks like a drought year, even though it's a little bit on the pluvial side. But we come out of that year with excess carryover in the reservoir system. So when you go to 2015, you don't have a ton of water in the system, but you do have some flood control starting as early as it looks like they're probably pushing up above the minimums as far back as early November. They're not huge numbers, but these numbers make a big difference if we can recharge that quantity because that's capturable water. Then if you look at 2017, the really largest pluvial in recent memory, again, the flood control starts more or less on March 1st, which a month later, the irrigation system kicks in and limits what you can recharge. But then the following year in 2018, you have a spectacular opportunity for recharge in the system. And so that's kind of how this system works. I just wanted to emphasize, as we're looking at these numbers, going back to the chart here, not all of that water is available that's spilling past Milner, because as you're entering into a pluvial year, you usually have a large flood control event, much of which can't be captured. But then in the following years, there's quite a bit to capture, and that's where we can really make up the difference, and we can get to our 350,000 acre feet with some to spare. And I think that covers the presentation. So when is most water available for recharge? The historical record indicates that the year after a pluvial is the best time to recharge because flood control operations will occur throughout much of the winter. During pluvial years, flood control often begins in February or March, which provides 1 to 2 months of recharge without irrigation limiting diversion capacity. But in the year after a pluvial, flood control can last almost all winter. So, and the best years for recharge would have been 2000, 2012, 2018. So that's what I have to present there.
So
Any questions?
do we have any questions from the committee members or water board members?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Al.
this is
Go ahead.
Al. David, you've got information about the water supply. Is there somewhere where we've captured the amount of water withdrawals from the aquifer over the years to see has that changed? Has that gone up? Has that gone down? Where are we in looking at that as part of our evaluation of the water supply?
Chairman and members of the board, I think we have a record of that, but I'm not up to date on that record, so I apologize.
Mr. Chairman, Al, that was a little beyond what David was looking at for this analysis, but we do have that information and we can queue that up for a future presentation if that's something you'd like to see.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Brian, I think it would be useful to know if what's going on is that the withdrawals are staying the same, they're going up, or they're going down, because it does matter in terms of how much water's available in the system. So, but I agree, it's probably not what David was tasked with here, but it just seemed to me like a missing link in terms of knowing what the water supply is. Don't we want to know how much water? I mean, if we're interested in how much water is in the aquifer, don't we want to know how much is being taken out?
Yeah, we'll queue that up for a future meeting.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, David, Brian O here. Another thing I think might be nice to track, at least going forward, in those, you call them pluvial years, is that the flood years?
Yeah,
There's probably, even though canals get full, there's probably a lot more opportunity for private recharge. As companies are looking at how much they're going to carry over and thinking they can make some money, it'd be nice if we could, we don't get credit for it as a board, but it's still, it's a credit to the aquifer. So I think it'd be nice if, and I'm sure IGWA probably tracks it, or maybe just the groundwater districts, but I think it'd be nice to see that tracked going forward.
Brian, we have those numbers and those were part of our last negotiation. And I think that's a pretty big number that I think IGWA's average private recharge number was.
Yeah. That'd be nice to see, Dean, if you don't mind sharing that. And in these years, like, the flood type years, I think there's a, capacity to do quite a bit that way, because you're not limited to just when the natural flow's in priority.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. David, thank you for the analysis there. We appreciate that. We'd like some back-to-back pluvial years. I guess that's what we want, isn't it?
yes, for sure.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, we'll move on to
Okay.
IDWR injection well processing. And, the potential use of recharge wells has become an important topic in eastern Idaho over the last several months. The Water Board has constructed a couple in remote areas that have been successful. With the 2024 settlement agreement between the groundwater districts and the Surface Water Coalition, some groundwater districts in eastern Idaho are considering the use of recharge wells as one strategy to offset their required pumping reductions. At the same time, there's also been some significant public scrutiny of recharge well proposals. This has led the Water Board to take a couple of actions. Number one, the board paused its funding of recharge wells temporarily until it could gather more information and decide what kind of sideboards it would like to put on its funding of recharge wells going forward. And two, the board requested information from the Department of Water Resources on the program, the regulatory framework, and permitting aspects of the injection well program. And Eric Bowe, who I think all of you know at this point as the Rules Coordination Officer, is here to present that requested information on the injection well program. So with that, I'll hand it over to Eric to make his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Today, as Brian noted, I'll be presenting IDWR injection well permitting as it relates to managed aquifer recharge. As far as the agenda for this presentation, I'll give it a little bit of a background, talk about the application process associated with MAR, touch on EPA comments we recently received, and next steps. So IDWR received primacy to administer Class 5 injection wells from EPA back in 1985. Since that time, we've maintained primacy. I believe we've had to apply for it at least a couple different times. The Class 5 injection wells are administered under IDAPA 370303, our injection well rules, or titled the Rules and Minimum Standards for the Construction and Use of Injection Wells. And these rules are based on, they establish criteria and standards for the injection of fluids corresponding to Class 5 injection wells. The definition of a Class 5 injection well is an injection well that injects non-hazardous fluid into or above a drinking water aquifer. The rules were based on state and federal code, specifically Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulation, Parts 141, 142, and 144 through 146. And then Idaho Code, Chapter 39, Title 42, titled Injection Well Rules. All proposed injection well rules are assigned EPA subclassifications. This is a key concept that we have to understand. And importantly, this EPA subclassification is defined by the source of the inject date, not what we're actually doing with it. Managed aquifer recharge injection wells are considered a 5R21 subclass. And the definition from our booklets below for 5R21, aquifer recharge wells, they're used to recharge depleted aquifers and may inject fluids from a variety of sources such as lakes, streams, domestic wastewater, treatment plants, and other aquifers. So in this case, obviously we're talking about river water from the Eastern Snake Plain. An important distinction here is canals, when used, they're used as a conduit to route river water to the point of injection, not canal water in the sense that some have described. Because the reality is we do not allow agricultural waste runoff to be injected. So the water coming through these canals should just be routed via the canal from the river source. Agricultural waste runoff are considered a 5F1 injection well. And we don't, at this time, consider them for managed aquifer recharge. New 5F1 injection wells have not been permitted since around 2000 is about when we last permitted those. We do have existing 5F1 injection wells, and we do allow them to be re-permitted. But the injection rates do have restrictions to ensure that there's no points of diversion within the area of influence. Points of rediversion within the area of influence. As far as program challenges that we have that have been getting progressively worse, lead time is increasing a bit. Over the last couple of years, we are seeing projects increasing in complexity. For example, the most common type of deep injection well that we have is a heat return pump. Pretty straightforward. The water taken out of the ground after it goes through a heat exchanger is re-injected, the same water from the aquifer. And so they don't take much effort to determine whether or not it can endanger the aquifer. It doesn't. But when we see, managed aquifer recharge wells, there's quite a bit more legwork that has to be accomplished. Currently, the UIC program is a 1 FTE program, and they're responsible for over 21,000 shallow injection wells and over 1,300 deep injection wells. And specifically, the deep injection wells, they require renewals every 3 to 10 years. So as we get more deep injection wells, it will increase the workload. So the 5R21 application process for managed aquifer recharge, again, the 5R21 is the subclass. Obviously, we receive an application. Typically, we have to request additional information because the application is lacking. Then we complete an application review and analysis, draft a monitoring plan, create a draft permit, publish a public notice, and then finalize the permit or denial. So as part of the process, when we receive the application, our FTE reviews it for completeness, then enters the data into our UIC database to document the information. It's at that time that we often notice that there's information that's missing that's necessary to process it appropriately. So the next step is typically we'll request additional information. And usually the information includes the following: project description, description of the purpose, and a physical description of the recharge site. We'll ask the applicant to describe, characterize the injectate, which is describe the quality, composition, and quantity of fluids to be injected. The applicant will have to describe the geologic and hydrogeologic conditions. And this would be at the regional, local, and then at the point of injection. The applicants typically ask for information to demonstrate that the injection well will not endanger a USDW. And USDW stands for underground source drinking water. And this is captured in Rule 7002D of the current rules. And then finally, we ask the applicant to propose a monitoring plan that would be effective for the site in question. During the application review, we ensure it's complete. We will calculate an area of influence based on criteria in our rules. We'll identify if there are any domestic wells or public water systems within the area of influence. And an important note that is if there are domestic wells within an area of influence, which can be quite large with these injection rates, monitoring is required. The next step is drafting the monitoring plan. We typically ask the applicant to provide a recommendation on one first, and we take that under advisement, and then we draft our own. The typical headings in the monitoring plan are listed here. First, we have a background, which is basically just a narrative describing the hydrogeologic connection between the injection or the point of injection and proposed monitoring locations. We have a section on monitoring locations and frequency, which defines the monitoring locations and frequency, whether it's biweekly or monthly, that will occur before, during, and after injection activities. Have a description of the recharge site or have requirements in there for the recharge site operation, which defines the operational requirements at the site. What to do, what the operator, for example, should do prior to initiating injection activities. They need to do a visual to make sure there's no sources of contamination that are present that they can visually identify. And then also required that, and another example would be, we typically add that the main valve must be isolated for at least 24 hours following application of any herbicides or pesticides in the fields. We have a section on catastrophic events. If there's a spill or something along those lines, we have make sure the operator knows they have to shut down the main valve. A map describing all the points of diversion around or describing the injection site, and then all the monitoring wells and/or domestic wells within the area. And then we have some tables. First up is the monitoring table in table 1. And that just lists all the monitoring wells and the analyte list associated with them. Table 2 for surface water, that's typically a monthly monitoring that is a injectate monitoring schedule. So in this case, the Snake River water. And then table 3 is a biweekly, so twice a month monitoring, which is a monitoring schedule for monitoring wells or domestic wells within the area of influence. Then we add appropriate conditions to the permit. One of the notable conditions would be that all deep injection wells must also meet our well construction standard rules. So there's certain requirements related to, for example, stick up. They cannot just be a cut flush to the ground with a trash rack on top of it. They must be constructed to our well construction standards that prevent sources of contamination from getting down into the aquifer. And then we attach the monitoring plan, all of our analyses that we did, the application that we received, and any additional information that we requested. Next, we draft a public notice. The draft permit notice is published in a newspaper of general circulation in the county for which the well is located. And this is in accordance with Rule 7003B, and which is consistent with statute. Comments that we receive from these public notices must be submitted to IDWR within 30 days following publication. And a hearing may be held by the director if deemed necessary. Finally, we draft the final permit or denial. If the application meets the requirements described in the rule, the final permit is drafted and issued to the applicant. However, if the director finds that the underground source drinking water cannot be protected from, quote, unreasonable contamination, the permit may be denied. And this is described in Rule 7004B of our current rules. Now, as Brian touched on, we did receive, the public has reached out with a number of concerns related to managed aquifer recharge and injection wells that directly inject into the aquifer. EPA and the Department of Water Resources take all these concerns very seriously. And EPA did reach out to us, and we did touch base. Added a couple general comments in here that we have talked about. The first of which I'll read. As EPA stated on a couple of different occasions, a central component of the UIC program, our underground injection control program, is the protection of USDWs from endangerment. And that's a key concept for EPA. Section 1421D(2) of the Safe Drinking Water Act states that, quote, underground injection endangers drinking water sources if such injection may result in any contamination in underground water, which supplies or can reasonably expect it to supply any public system, and the contamination may result in the system not complying with any national primary drinking water regulation or otherwise adversely affect public health. The next point is prior to approval of any aquifer recharge well, subclass 5R21, applicants must provide information that supports or demonstrates that a USDW will be protected from endangerment. And finally, as a reminder, our primacy program, as a primacy program, state regulation of class 5 injection wells must be as stringent or more stringent than federal regulation. As far as next steps for the program, we have formed a technical working group with the EPA just to touch base and ensure that the permits for managed aquifer recharge injection wells are in compliance with federal code, and just to make sure we're all aware of the best known practices for permitting these applications. We have also formed a technical working group at DEQ, mainly to discuss overlapping regulation and collaborate on the MAR projects. The overlap of the state rules includes the Source Water Protection Program, the Public Drinking Water System rules in IDAPA 580108, and the Idaho Groundwater Quality Rule in 580111. Some of the potential outcomes that are likely to occur from these meetings, I think it's safe to assume that we will see changes on how we process 5R21 applications to improve the process. There will likely be updates to permit conditions that we add on these permits. We will likely be incorporating new spatial tools to determine whether or not an MAR project will impact source drinking water. And then finally, there'll be a focus on the applicant will need to provide site-specific information rather than generalized information that supports or demonstrates that injection activities will not endanger a USDW aquifer. We've only had, we have our second meeting with the EPA, I think this week, and we've had a couple with DEQ. So we're in the early stages of that, but so there will be more to come as we progress. And that's all I have. Happy to stand for any questions Mr. Chairman or the board may have.
Yeah, this is Chairman is Dean Stevenson here. Question: are we currently processing or the renewal applications for injection wells that have already been in place?
Mr. Chairman, Member Stevenson, we're processing all applications right now that we receive, whether renewal or new.
So these changes are going to take place in the future after the consultation, the working group.
Yeah, there will be, sorry, Mr. Chairman, Member Stevenson. Yes, these will, we have applications right now. And the current step that we're in is we requested additional information like we typically do. But as we learn more information on what to look for, we are requesting some of this information that's coming out of these meetings. For example, we're going to be requesting site-specific information on how the injection activities will not impact the USDW.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from board members?
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is Joanne Cole-Hansen. Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead, Joanne.
Eric, is it standard procedure to test private drinking water wells near a proposed injection site?
Mr. Chairman, Member Cole-Hansen, yes, we're required to measure domestic wells that lie within the area of influence There is a waiver process. For example, if there's a high number of domestic wells that are, say, closer than a well that's further away, we can waive certain domestic wells and not measure those as long as we're measuring other ones that are representative.
Mr. Chair, I have a follow-up question.
Well, go ahead, Joanne.
If the private owner denies access to testing their well, what happens to the permit process?
Mr. Chairman, Member Cole-Hansen, that's a good question. To be honest, we don't have a lot of these wells. We have maybe, to take a step back, managed aquifer recharge has been occurring in Idaho since about 1985, mostly around the Southwest Irrigation District, around Burley area. To that point, we've never had an issue where injection activities contaminated a drinking water well. But most of the locations, we only had maybe, I think we're on the order of 40 in total, mostly in remote locations. And then now over the last couple of years, we've permitted, in the eastern part of Idaho more, I think around 7 or 8. And so we don't have that many. So we actually, to my understanding, we haven't ran into a situation where a homeowner refused to allow his well to be monitored, his or her well to be monitored. Off the top of my head, if that situation happens, we would probably look and see if there's other monitoring locations that we can monitor up gradient from that point. Potentially ask the applicant to drill a monitoring well if necessary. But we would need some kind of monitoring prior to that point. We'd have to incorporate that. And I do know in one instance, I don't know if the homeowner refused to allow monitoring, but I know of one instance where a monitoring well was constructed up gradient in between the injection activities and the domestic well. So.
Okay. Any other questions? Comments from the board?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Pat.
Eric, is there any potential or value in adding proximity location to the public notice system? Like in the city where you get a building permit, you have to notify adjoiners. I wondered if there's any potential to do that, because that was one of the things that came up repeatedly in the communications we received, was that people had no idea this was going on. So could that be included as part of the process, or is that too tedious?
I think that's, or Mr. Chairman, committee member, I think that's something that we can do better. In the past, we followed code and our rules and advertise it in the newspaper for the county. In situations like these, we typically identify the monitoring well locations that are within the area of influence. And so we have that information prior to submitting the public notice. So that is something that we are talking about, reaching out and getting public comment for folks that would be, directly impacted.
Mr. Chairman, one more question.
Go ahead, Pat.
So the proximity wells that you're talking about, are those existing domestic and like farm wells, or are they wells that we drilled or wells that we developed?
Mr. Chairman, committee member, yes, that's a good question and clarification. So we have the point of injection, which is the injection well. And then based on the flow rate that we're injecting, utilize, it's a very conservative calculation that we determine the area of influence related to that flow rate. It's not perfect, but it's actually quite conservative, so it appears. When we draw that circle, all the points, we'll identify all the domestic wells in there. And if there is a public water system, but there's never been within the area, to my understanding, within the area of influence. And then we'll use those domestic wells as monitoring locations, because we do want to monitor those wells. Or if we need a better location, we can request, and have in the past requested an actual monitoring well. To your point, if there are ag wells in the area and they're constructed at the appropriate depth that would be representative of what we're looking for, we certainly would use an irrigation well for a monitoring location. Again, we don't have a ton of these right now, but that's something that we would look into, especially given the fact that, we are projecting potentially to see quite a few more applications related to this, which could be, effectively like an order of magnitude more water that we're proposing. So, yeah, that's something we'll look at.
Thank you, Eric.
Any other questions from,
Mr. Chairman, this is Jeff, if I could.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Eric, you indicated that you're having discussions with EPA and DEQ. What sort of a time frame are you looking at to kind of complete that review and establish the updated guidelines?
Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. I don't have EPA hasn't identified a specific timeline, probably until they're satisfied. But I think in principle, they understand with what we're doing. And it's just mainly just to communicate, make sure we're implementing best known methods. Obviously, the practice of hydrogeology has evolved over the years, and there's a lot more technology and thoughts that, maybe we might look at incorporating. So yeah, I don't know how long that'll be. And also with DEQ, I'm not sure how long that's going to be. I anticipate at least a few months, but there will be some changes, as an outcome. I hope to establish a good guideline for managed aquifer recharge injection well processing, which would be very helpful since we only have one FTE that individual can focus on and make sure they're hitting all the key requirements. So ultimately, we'll have something formalized like that. But as we work through the process, we will be incorporating some steps. One of which, additionally, is going to be that DEQ is going to they requested to be involved in making comments. So when we get to the point of publishing notice, we will notify DEQ so they can provide comments. And yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Any other questions from?
Mr. Chairman, Al Barker, one
Go ahead, Al.
follow-up. I think I asked, Pat asked one of the questions I was going to ask. The other one is, oh, and by the way, how long it's going to take depends on how long we have people still working at EPA. But the question I have, Eric, is how do recharge pits fit into the injection well analysis? Are they considered injection wells that they have to go through this same process, or is there a separate pathway for a recharge pit that's not a drilled well?
Mr. Chairman, Committee Member Barker, that's a great question. And as an aside, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to have my EPA meeting this week. It might be on hold a little bit. I haven't heard from them since over the last couple of weeks. But yeah, related to your question, we have rapid infiltration basins or spreading basins. Those are not regulated as injection wells as long as they're not engineered. They are loosely, I don't, I'd have to have DEQ chime in, but my understanding that DEQ through their groundwater program doesn't quote unquote permit them, but they do approve a monitoring plan associated with them. In a perfect world, certainly everybody involved in the regulation of managed aquifer recharge, even if you look at the literature, spreading basins are ideal. Rapid infiltration basins are ideal. And the main reason is it increases the environmental buffer between the point of injection and a drinking water aquifer. And especially in cases where you have a good vadose zone, where it essentially slows that, take of water a little bit, you can get a lot of the contaminants that are likely to occur in surface water would be, effectively, quote unquote, trapped. I don't know if that's the right term, but they can be filtered out through surface water. So yes, spreading basins are ideal. They don't work in all locations though, but they're certainly ideal.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, so that if there's going to be let's take one of the boards or recharge basins. Do we have to get an injection well permit for that? But I know we also do our own monitoring. And is that required by IDWR or DEQ?
Mr. Chairman, Member Barker, yes. So no, you do not need a permit from the Department of Water Resources. We don't consider it an injection well. However, the data that you're collecting is part of a monitoring plan that's approved by DEQ, or sorry, yeah, by DEQ. And so that is required, but not by IDWR.
Got it. Thanks very much.
Mr. Chairman, Eric, Brian O here.
Go ahead, Brian.
Just one last one for me, Eric. I don't think you mentioned what's the frequency of the monitoring at the local domestic wells around the injection site. And the only reason I ask is I'm drinking canal water at my place. Not an injection well, but shallow, relatively shallow farm well. And I've had coliform tests, both positive and negative, within pretty short periods. So, if you're, and some of those, I might have contaminated myself. I mean, I have runoff from my horse corral and that kind of stuff, but just, I think it's pretty important that we have pretty frequent on the monitoring.
Mr. Chairman, committee member, yes, I completely agree with you. We want to have monitoring as much as possible, or highest frequency as possible. The challenge is, collecting those samples. It takes time to get them to the lab. It takes time to grow it on the Petri dish and get a response, get a measurement, for example. So what we've typically been doing historically is we do for say a domestic well or a monitoring well. So this is not the injection point per se. We typically do twice a month. And I think that's fairly consistent with what, for example, DEQ required with our rapid infiltration basins. But that's just as I recall. But yeah, there could be a conversation to increase that always. But to date, we've landed on 2 weeks.
Thank you.
I have a question. How do you determine that area of the impact there, the zone around that you'll have to test, or wells that you would consider to be impacted? What's the criteria?
Chairman Raybould, Mr. Committee Member, yes, there's a lot to that when you start talking about fate and transport of any contaminant that's potentially injected. What we have is a conservative calculation that's based on injection rate. I don't have the study. I don't know it offhand. It was centered in the ESPA, and I believe it was conducted around in the late 80s. And in that test, I believe that's where we came up with the calculation and table that we have in our rules that essentially bases this quote area of influence, which is a conservative estimate based on the injection rate, which is obviously plays a big factor when you consider an area of influence.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for the presentation. That was very enlightening. It sounds like we got a lot of work to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Eric for making that presentation, Mr. Chairman. He's quite busy, as you can tell, and I want to thank him for taking the time out to provide that today.
All right, members of the committee, do we have any other items to bring up?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, just in terms of logistics, we will, when you conclude this meeting, we'll take about 5 minutes and then we will start the special board meeting, which is largely an executive session. She's online. And you do have to use the different Zoom link that Jennifer sent out a few days ago to Zoom in for the special board meeting.
Okay. All right, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second by Brian.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
All right.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you
Okay,
all.
we'll see you